It's 7 o'clock Eastern time. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes here, get a few more people on, and then we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar series. This is Jim Alexander. I'm the Executive Director and Founder of the Industry Pharmacists Organization. Before we get started, I just want to point out a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, for those who are participating tonight, you'll see an Ask a Question button kind of at the upper left of your screen. At any point during the presentation and then at the end, we'll address as many questions as we have an opportunity to. Tonight it's my great pleasure, like I said, to continue our webinar series. Tonight it's Continuing Medical Education. We're fortunate to have with us Dr. Bethsy Jacob. Bethsy is a fellow in medical affairs at Haymarket Medical Education, and she's a graduate of St. John's. Before Bethsy gets started, and I'll turn it over to her in just a second, just to remind anybody who's new to this that archived on the IPHO website, we've already got a number of these webinars, so I encourage you to visit the resources section. And as far as that goes, tonight's will also be recorded and available most likely starting tomorrow. So with that, I'm really pleased to turn over to Bethsy and look forward to an interesting session. Thanks.
Hello. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead,
Thank
Bethsy.
you, Jim. Thank you, Jim, for the introduction. I hope all of you guys can hear me loud and clearly. So good evening, everyone. Like Jim said, my name is Bethsy Jacob, and I am currently the Medical Affairs Fellow at Haymarket Medical Education. So thank you all for joining us today for this webinar on the CME industry, and hopefully I'll be able to, increase all of your understanding of the CME industry and what it's like to work in this sort of setting as a pharmacist. So basic overview of what I want to tell you guys today. The first thing is that I'll explain the value of CME and why it's important for healthcare professionals to have lifelong learning. I'll briefly go through the regulations within the CME industry and the whole planning process that goes behind a CME activity. And then I'll delve into the role of a pharmacist in the industry and the opportunities there are for pharmacy students. And of course, leave some time for Q&A. So as I'm talking about the CME industry and as I'm explaining about it, I'll also share a little bit of my own experiences as a fellow and talk about my personal experiences as a fellow at HME. So basic definition of what CME is. They are educational activities that help healthcare professionals maintain or increase knowledge, skills, professional performance, and relationships. So I'm assuming most of you who are listening at this time are current pharmacy students, and you may be looking forward to graduating and getting your license and ending the studying and ending, preparing for exams. But of course, learning for healthcare professionals is a lifelong process, and it doesn't end once we get our license, unfortunately. The medical field is constantly being updated with new data. So something such as guidelines that are accepted today can be considered outdated tomorrow. So therefore, there's a need for continuing education for healthcare professionals, not only to stay updated and provide the best care for patients, but on a more technical level, we also need it for our state and board requirements to maintain our license. So bottom line, learning for the healthcare professionals, such as pharmacists, is a lifelong process. So here are some visual examples of CME websites. Most of you guys may be familiar with Medscape. mycme.com is the web portal of Haymarket Medical Education. Pharmacist Letter is another example where you can see and participate in CE. So just to put all of this into better perspective for pharmacists, pharmacists in New Jersey, for example, are required to fulfill 30 CE credits over a 2-year cycle. And this varies depending on what state you get your license in. So there are many outlets to obtain these CE credits. So these are just some visual examples where a pharmacist can go to get those CE activities. So why is CME important? Like I said, CME helps clinicians keep current and updated in the field. So these are just various areas of education that a CME activity can cover. For example, CME can be a great way for you to learn about emerging medications. What are the new meds in the diabetes landscape, for example, or what are the new guidelines that are going to be out there. So one of the advantages of being involved and having a career in the CME industry as a pharmacist is that you're constantly being updated in various areas of medicine, such as these, as you're helping in the development of these activities. So this is something I personally enjoy about working in the CME industry. I'm constantly being updated on emerging medications in a specific therapeutic area or new guidelines, for example. And there's also good exposure to the experts because a lot of CME activities are led by KOLs. And so it's a good industry to go into where you're constantly being updated on various medical areas. So these are just a few specific topics that a CME or CE activity can focus on. For example, with the approval of long-acting opioids, the FDA is now encouraging pharmacists and other healthcare professionals to complete CEs on extended release opioids so that we can safely prescribe, so we can safely dispense these agents. So what's interesting is that pharmacy school education, it's very structured throughout the 6 years. But once you graduate and you obtain your license, you take control of your own learning to maintain that active license. So the only requirement may be to fulfill certain credits covering pharmacy law. So once you have your license, you have a lot of leeway, a lot of options as to what you want to learn through CME and CE. Okay, so if there are so many topics that are out there, the question might be, can the CME industry create activities on anything and everything? And so technically the answer to that question is no, it cannot. And this is a good diagram to explain why. CME is meant to address a gap in care. So if there's a gap between actual practice and expected practice, the CME activity can be the bridge to close that gap. So, for example, maybe pharmacists aren't appropriately counseling patients on proper inhaler techniques for their asthma patients. So a CME activity can teach a pharmacist on better strategies to communicate to their patients. So there should always be an intended purpose for the education, and this intended purpose is usually stated upfront in any CME or CE activity. So are there actual gaps in practice? And if there are gaps in practice, how do we even find out what these gaps are? And there are several ways to actually find gaps in practice. This can be done through conducting a clinician survey or an interview or doing a literature search on PubMed. And a pharmacist can get involved in finding the gaps there are in practice. So here is an example of something that I found by just conducting a literature search. This is a specific example with the influenza immunization. It was found that fewer than half of individuals eligible for the flu vaccine were vaccinated last season during 2012-2013. And if vaccination levels actually reached the 70% target of Healthy People 2020, then the following estimates could have been averted: 5.9 million illnesses, 2.3 million medically attended illnesses, 42,000 hospitalizations. So clearly, this states that there is a gap, and this is where a CME activity can get involved and help close this gap. So we can stick with this example and show how a CME activity can help minimize or bridge that gap. This is a specific program that was and is posted on mycme.com. Influenza immunization, increasing immunization rates. So the outcomes that were collected from this program showed that 50% respondents said their vaccine administration rate increased by 5 to 10%. 17% said it increased by 11 to 20%. So clearly, you can see from the numbers that there is an upward trend, but there's still much more room for improvement. So a CME activity can help bridge the gap, but there's always room for more improvement. That can kind of lead the way for more CME activities. So this industry is also heavily regulated, and there's multiple stakeholders involved. And for someone who's interested in a career in the CME industry, it's good to have an understanding of the key players in this industry and all the regulations that are involved in CME. Okay, so you might be wondering, is CME promotional? And the answer is no, it is not promotional. CME is considered independent medical education, and it's separated from promotional medical communication. There is a strict firewall between the independent medical education side and the promotional side. And so what does it mean to be independent medical education. Firstly, you have to have a balanced view of therapeutic options. So if an activity mentions one beta blocker, you want to go in and make sure that all the others are mentioned. If efficacy is mentioned, you want to make sure that safety and other warnings are mentioned. So this is one of my responsibilities as a fellow in the CME industry, is to make sure that there is fair balance in that activity. And in general, if you look at a CME activity, you'll notice that most of the time generic names are used. And if there is any mention of trade names, then you have to make sure that the trade names or the brand names of all the medications are used. And if a medication has more than one brand name, then you should list all of the brand names from several companies. So this is also something that I check for, and this is not the case for promotional education or promotional communication. You'll see that brand names are listed in promotional communication. And one other thing that I want to mention about independent medical communication is that most of the time, or all the time, in independent medical communication, you can discuss off-label use of drugs, but it should always be disclosed. Whereas in promotional education, you have to stay within the labeled FDA-approved use for that drug. So that's another key difference between the promotional side and the medical education side. So this slide shows some terms that are constantly used in the CME industry. Commercial supporter, sponsor, grantor, all refer to the pharma company. The educational CME provider is the agency or the vendor, and the faculty refers to the speaker or the lecturer or the key opinion leader involved in the CME activity. So there are multiple stakeholders involved in the CME industry, and I'll briefly touch upon some of these key stakeholders and the role that they have. So accreditation. In many things we come across, there are standards that have to be met. And the same goes true for medical education. An activity that offers continuing education has to be compliant with certain standards to make sure that quality education is being provided. And these standards are developed by what's known as accrediting bodies. And I'll give examples of specific accrediting bodies for CME and CE. So just going down the chain on the right side of the slide, accrediting bodies give accreditation to CME providers or accredited providers. So Haymarket Medical Education, where I'm currently doing my fellowship, is an example of a CME provider. And then once a provider becomes accredited, they can certify CME, CE activities for MDs, DOs, PharmDs, NPs, PAs, etc. So these are examples of accrediting bodies for various types of healthcare professionals. You guys are most likely to be familiar with the Accreditation Council for Pharmacy Education, otherwise known as ACPE. And they really have two functions. The first is to give accreditation to a pharmacy school, and the second is actually to give accreditation to CME providers of continuing pharmacy education. So bottom line, the purpose for these accrediting bodies is to make sure that CME standards are being met and providers of CME are being compliant and providing quality education. So these are types of educational providers. Academic institutions, hospitals, nonprofit medical organizations, government military organizations, insurance and managed care companies, and medical education companies. So your College of Pharmacy, for example, can be a CME or CE provider. And these educational providers can or may often submit proposals to commercial supporters, such as pharma companies, to financially sponsor a CME activity. And the proposal gives like a huge outline of what is, of the anticipated CME activity. So pharmacists working for a CME provider, such as a medical education company, can be involved in proposal writing for various therapeutic areas. And this is another area that I'm involved in as a pharmacist in the CME industry. This is where medical writing and drug information and overall clinical knowledge can be used as a pharmacist in the CME industry. So you'll notice that, there are many instances where a CME activity or a CE activity is offered for free. And, there's no cost to the healthcare professional, even though a lot of time and effort is put into developing the CME activity. And that's because oftentimes pharma companies or biotech companies, device companies, they have an invested interest to sponsor the CME activity. They may want clinicians to better diagnose COPD, for example, or recognize the signs and symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis. They may want clinicians to be aware of new guidelines or emerging agents such as their own pipeline drugs. So a commercial supporter is someone who provides financial contributions to pay for all or part of a CME activity. And what's important to know is that the commercial supporter has no input into the content or the selection of the speakers or the faculty, because, like I said, CME is considered as independent medical education, so it's separated from promotional communication. And pharma companies on their side will have or can have established CME departments or a medical affairs team. And so the medical affairs team often reviews proposals that are submitted by the CME provider. And that team, that CME department or that medical affairs department can be, staffed by pharmacists as well. So once a proposal is approved, that pharma company cannot have any influence over the content. And like I said, that's the difference between education and promotion. So faculty are very important stakeholders in CME activity. Most CME activity will have key opinion leaders involved, and they help shape the activity content because of the clinical experience they have in a particular therapeutic area. So they are considered the experts in the field. Usually the faculty names are listed up front in a CME activity, and they are given honoraria by the accredited provider. So a pharmacist working in the CME industry will likely have, multiple interactions with KOLs during the whole development process. And that could be across various therapeutic areas. But what's important to know is that, any faculty involved in the CME activity, they have to share their disclosures. So there has to be no conflict of interest. And if there is any conflict of interest, that conflict of interest has to be resolved. Even having a spouse who is employed at the sponsor company or at the pharma company can be considered as a conflict of interest. So all conflicts of interest have to be resolved and disclosed. So I'll briefly go through how a CME activity is, put together, and it involves, 3 overall steps, and it's to plan, to develop, and lastly to analyze the activity results. So planning a CME activity involves a lot of research to find what the gaps are in practice. Like I said, a CME activity can't just be about anything. It should bridge some gaps there is in practice. And this is where drug information skills developed in pharmacy school can become very useful. And gaps are found by several means. It can be done by conducting faculty interviews or doing medical literature search or looking at the results of past CME programs or from annual meetings. And then based on the research that you do, you'll build a case for an educational need. So, for example, is there a need to, for clinicians to know when to initiate treatment for rheumatoid arthritis? Or is there a need for clinicians to know how to apply, the latest lipid guidelines? So you'll find that there is an educational need in, whatever therapeutic area, and then learning objectives are created. So you'll know what the endpoints of your CME activity are as you're planning the CME activity itself. So all of the information here is going to be included into a proposal that will be submitted to a pharma company or a commercial supporter. So these are various steps that are a part of developing the CME activity, and it's in no particular order. And the pharmacist can get involved in most of these steps. They can get involved in, actually writing and creating evidence-based content or reviewing that content. As a fellow, oftentimes I'll invite and reach out to faculty members or KOLs to get involved in the CME program. Pharmacists can get involved in identifying who the target audience is for a specific program. For example, if there's a CME activity that's, focused on asthma, are we going to target pharmacists? Are we going to target pulmonologists or primary care physicians? Another important step is to actually, get involved in designing the educational activities, because there are multiple platforms that a CME activity can be delivered in. It can be a webinar or a case-based monograph or a roundtable discussion with, multiple physicians, or it can also be a simulated activity. And of course, as always, you want to make sure that there is independence from the commercial supporter and, there's fair balance throughout the activity. So, like I mentioned before, a CME activity can be delivered through multiple different platforms. It can be a live activity such as a conference or a webcast. CME can also be delivered as print, such as a monograph or slides. And nowadays, a lot of CME is turning to web-based. And so, as learners or as clinicians, we all prefer to learn in different ways. So there are multiple resources that we can use in order to, obtain our CE credit. So it all depends on what the learner prefers. Here are some visual examples of different delivery platforms. Like I said before, a CME activity can be live, such as a live meeting or a conference. It can be print, and it can be web-based. And of course, with any CME activity, outcomes are measured. And so there are different levels of outcomes that can be measured from a CME activity, starting with just participating in a CME activity all the way down to measuring outcomes and changes in overall community health. So one typical way of measuring outcomes in a CME activity is having a pre-activity test and a post-activity test and seeing if the results were better during the post-activity. So overall, you just want to make sure that you're having a positive impact on clinicians' knowledge and clinicians' performance through that CME activity. And you want to show that positive impact by measuring outcomes. So here is a diagram just to show the overall process behind developing a CME activity. Step one is to identify a certain gap in practice, and then you'll want to create a needs assessment based on that gap. So this needs assessment is the case or the proposal you'll submit to the commercial supporter to show the need to sponsor a CME activity. And then within that proposal or the needs assessment, you'll include your learning objectives for the CME activity, or what are the endpoints you're trying to reach through the CME activity. And then, you'll go through the various steps that are involved in designing the CME activity. And then lastly, the outcomes are measured for the CME activity. And oftentimes, those outcomes are reported back to the commercial support to show, the positive change that you're having in the clinician's performance and in the clinician's understanding through the CME activity. So pharmacists can get involved in multiple steps in a CME activity and in the CME industry overall. They can help, write the needs assessment and help put together the proposal that is submitted to the commercial supporter. They can be involved in the educational design of an activity. So, for example, if there is a roundtable discussion between multiple specialties, such as a rheumatologist and a dermatologist, a pharmacist can be involved in recruiting the faculty for the patients to film for the roundtable discussion, and then help create the discussion points for that, roundtable program. And of course, there will be multiple interactions and communications with KOLs and the commercial supporter as well. A pharmacist can help make sure that there's fair balance within a CME activity and it's not, biased towards one particular drug. And then, of course, lastly, a pharmacist can be involved in measuring the outcomes of the activity to see what are the changes that resulted because of the activity. So here are some opportunities for pharmacy students who are interested in the CME industry. One way to know more about the CME industry and what it's like to be working in this field is to reach out or look for different types of internships or rotations within medical education. Another way is to perhaps, look into postdoctoral training with one-year PharmD fellowship in independent medical education. So these types of experiences will help, give hands-on training and practical experience in the CME industry. And at the same time, it will also provide networking opportunities for other professionals and other pharmacists who are also involved in the CME industry. So I would recommend, doing research and finding out if there are any internships and rotations in the medical education side, especially for any of you who are interested, in medical writing and in using your drug information skills and being constantly updated on various therapeutic areas. And, I would recommend looking into this industry as a potential career. And if you guys have any questions, like Jim said, feel free to ask in the question box. Unfortunately, I don't think these slides will be posted, but you can always refer back to the recording.
Okay, so thanks, Bethsy. That was terrific. We got one question started, and please, I hope everybody has some questions and submits them. But anyway, Stephen asks, what got you interested in CME fellowship or CME in general?
Hello?
Bethsy?
Hello?
Yeah, so
Hello?
Stephen asked,
okay.
what got you interested in CME, and what got you interested in a CME fellowship?
Yeah, so the CME industry was not something that I was fully, or really aware of while I was a pharmacy student. So I kind of stumbled upon this industry through networking, and that's why it's really important to network and, reach out to your preceptors, reach out to your mentors to see what are the other types of, careers that a pharmacist can or a pharmacy student can go into other than the traditional retail or hospital setting. And so I found out about CME through networking, and it interested me because it's not really tied down. Being in this industry, you're not really tied down to one specific therapeutic area or a few specific drugs. You can get involved, or there's potential to be involved in multiple different therapeutic areas or multiple different drugs or devices. And so that's what interested me about this industry, because as I'm involved in helping in the development of an activity, I'm also constantly being updated myself. And, another thing that intrigued me about this industry is the interaction that you have with experts in the field and, multiple KOLs who know the therapeutic area in and out. And so these are just, a few of the different things that interested me about CME. And the way I found it is through networking. I didn't have a rotation per se in CME, but I did have a few industry rotations. And so I knew I wanted something a little bit outside of the traditional retail or hospital setting.
And I'll just add to that, Bethsy, which is every pharmaceutical company who is considering funding CME activities as a grantor, they have their own department. Often it includes pharmacists who are making decisions on grant proposals that come from the company like Bethsy works for. So they might announce that they're considering proposals for CME funding in a specific therapeutic area, and submit your proposals by May 1st. They might get 50 of those. Anyway, so that group, the independent medical education group within the company, is considering those different proposals and selecting them. So there's a career track on the pharma side as well. The larger the company, the more individuals are employed in a department like that. And in a small company or a startup even, it might just be somebody in the medical affairs group who that's part of their job. Turning over to the next question, Bethsy, which is, could you describe a typical workday in your fellowship?
That's a really good question. And I think the answer to that is that there really is no typical workday. And that's because in the CME industry, you're just involved in multiple projects simultaneously. So one moment I'll be working on writing a proposal, for example, in asthma, and that's something that I'll be doing on the side. But at the same time, within that same day, I'll be working on reviewing a case for another therapeutic area or developing CME questions in another sponsored activity. So there are multiple projects that are going on at the same time, and so there really is no typical day. It kind of comes as you go. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question, but if you have any specific questions, then I'll
I think further. You're probably involved at just about every step along the way of that diagram, the flow chart that you showed, all the different steps from inception to the point where the activity is launched, and then afterwards as well in terms of the outcomes that you summarize a year later. You don't work on it in a longitudinal sense, like Bethsy said. I think you're working on a needs assessment for one project and the outcomes on another activity that might have been launched a year earlier. Another question here is about the application process for a CME fellowship, Bethsy. is it the same or different from a regular industry fellowship?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question, Jim?
Yeah, a question about the application process for a CME-focused fellowship. Is it the same as the process is the same as applying for an industry fellowship, or is it different in some way?
The process is generally similar. It depends on what program you're specifically applying to. So I'm aware that the Rutgers program, for example, has a fellowship that was offered in independent medical education. I don't know if it's still being offered, but someone who's interested in the Rutgers fellowship program, for example, would go through the steps required for that program. But, at the same time, another program such as Haymarket Medical Education can also accept applicants. And it really depends on the program. Some programs go through PPS and the whole media process. And a new initiative that's being started is the Fellow Match, which IPHO offers. So just to go specifically into my fellowship, that is something that we do. We recruit through Fellow Match as opposed through PPS and mid-year. So it really depends on the program. Jim, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I think it's pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Some of the timing is different on some of the fellowship programs, but the question around the CME fellowship, is it different from the regular industry fellowship? No. There's 270 fellowships or fellows in the United States, and so they're all, kind of a similar application process, I would say. And, some of them are located at pharmaceutical companies. Some of them are located at service provider companies like Haymarket, Wesley Enterprises is another one on the West Coast. There's a number of companies who aren't in the business of manufacturing pharmaceuticals that also offer fellowships. They're closely related to the pharmaceutical industry. So, what are your plans after completing your CME fellowship, Bethsy?
That is a really good question. So, I'm actually leaving the CME side, and I'm heading over across the firewall to the promotional side. So it's really interesting because I'll get, a good feel for both sides of medical communication. So I did this 1-year postdoctoral fellowship on the CME side, and now I'm moving ahead or transitioning into the promotional side. So hopefully I can, carry the skills that I developed in the CME side and be able to apply it on the promotional side. Especially, skills such as medical writing, for example, is something that's really useful to have in both areas of medical communication.
And do you think the background that you've been getting, the learning, would help you in seeking a pharmaceutical industry position in the future?
Oh, definitely. If that is something that I'm interested in the future, because overall the technical skills are the same. Skills such as communication and being able to work independently or being able to work on in teams, medical writing, drug information research. A lot of the technical skills are the same, so hopefully I'll be able to build and develop these technical skills and just be able to apply it on the pharma side, if I'm interested in the pharma side.
Okay, it looks like the group is out of questions, so I want to thank all of the participants tonight for coming and participating in the webinar. Again, it'll be archived on our website in the resources section, so please visit there if you want to, see some of the slides again or whatever. And also there's several other activities that are archived there. So I want to thank Bethsy for her time and participating in this aspect of the IPHO webinar series. I think it's great the experience that you shared. It's probably something that most students don't get a whole lot of exposure to, so great that they could learn about it. So thanks to everyone, and if you have any questions, you can always email us at support@industrypharmacist.org. So thanks again to Bethsy, and good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.